came email this morning. And I guess you can all hear this and figure it out. Question is, why aren't we pursuing a more stringent and resilient building energy code to reduce carbon emissions? So Gunnar, that was probably your wheelhouse in EPA. I know you have a little experience with that.
I think probably the simplest answer to that is there's not a general agreement right now in this country that we need to lessen carbon emissions. We still are fighting this battle. Is it real? Do we care? The way I come out on the answer is absolutely yes, but we don't have a national energy policy. And without that, it's going to be very hard to get people to think that you need to take those kinds of things into consideration when you're building or rebuilding for the future. Suffice it to say that right now, you could put, well, our daughter just did it. They built a house that's a LEED Gold house that is very environmentally sensitive and much less on a per square foot basis than a stick-built house because it's a modular. And it was done in a way that makes it sensible. You can do it. You can do it and you can do these kinds of things affordably, but until people accept that this is a problem, but carbon is something out there. You know, it's something big, it's something spewed out every day. We don't know really what difference it makes, and we don't know how we individually can control it. And we're not going to get, government responds to the public. They respond to their constituents. And until we start to tell people we care about these issues, and we start to tell them that this makes a difference on how we vote and who we support, we're going to find it's difficult to get government to plan in that way.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this one? Chris? Okay.
Associate myself with the remark.
Chris, you, nothing from you? Okay. Here's a question for Admiral Allen. How do you balance the need to harden with the flexibility necessary for resilience in the post-9/11 America?
Well, first of all, you can't achieve 100% security or 100% protection. What you have to do is you have to have a realistic assessment of risk and what risk you need to manage. I get asked all the time, for example, is it safe to drill in the Gulf? And my answer is it's not the right question. There is no risk-free way to extract hydrocarbons from the earth. The real question is what's an acceptable level of risk to offset the fact that we need to have these hydrocarbons at least for the next 30 years until we come up with alternate renewable energy. We move to public safety, whether it's an act of terrorism or hardening infrastructure or even looking at the southwest border. I think what you have to say is what is the most consequential and likely thing that's going to happen? How do you want to manage that risk? And what is an acceptable level of risk in terms of the activity that you're carrying out? So if you need access to a particular area and you have to build a bridge or something, what is the acceptable level of risk you're willing to accept to create that transportation link? And then how do you want to mitigate the risk of future damage and create that resiliency in how you actually build the structure?
Thank you. Anybody else on that one? Okay, move on. This question comes via Twitter. How do we incorporate the costs of resiliency and recovery into land prices? How do we incorporate the cost of resiliency and recovery into land prices? Anybody?
I venture a quick answer, but I think Chris is probably the better one to do this, but I'd say it's going to happen on its own. Land value is going to be reflective of demand, and demand is going to be reflective of what people perceive as being a place they want to be and a place that will be there for the future. But Chris, you can
yeah, that's a tricky question because we're seeing now, I don't know if any of you saw in the last day or so, there's been some reports about values of properties that have been devastated are actually going up. And the reason they're going up is that the people who can't afford them having to sell because they don't have insurance or they otherwise just don't have the kind of money necessary to deal with the demolition costs and the rebuilding. So they're selling at the moment at a lower cost. But the person who buys and builds a bigger house higher up, which means the value of that house is going to be a lot higher. So it's more resilient. And that's what part of the argument is that raises the price. I agree with the governor that in the end it's going to be market forces that largely do it until we get the but the wherewithal and the courage in government and these groups of citizens to say, wait a second, where should we be building and how should we be building overall? And in some areas, maybe we shouldn't be building at all, and we ought to step in and say, yeah, maybe we have to compensate people for the loss of land if that's what it takes, but maybe we ought to just raise the buildings and let things restore to a natural setting, much like we're trying to do in places like Sayreville, in sections of Sayreville, and you'll see also in Moonachie and Little Ferry and other areas like that.
And I would just add, it's the intersection of the land and what's built on it. This gets back to the intersection of the natural and the built environment and what is the best way to do that.
I'll just weigh in. I agree with real estate is my area, and I definitely think it's going to be the market that's going to determine that. If government tries to get involved too much, I think that actually would probably turn out to be a bad thing because it'll just artificially interfere with the market. Next question, actually I want to remind those of you who are not in the room that the hashtag is PostSandy, and the email is csdforum@ucsusa.org. Next question. Given the comments, can you speak to the fact that there is no current re-examination of coastal land use policy which contributes to damage and risk? I think there's two questions here. Can you speak to the fact that there is no current re-examination of coastal land use policy? And if so, why not? Or is it a good idea, I guess is the question.
I gather the new FEMA money, or the new federal money, relief money, the 1.5 billion that's coming into the state is actually going to require using climate models to determine standards and what can be rebuilt and where. And that's the first time we've seen that required, and that's interesting given that you just had in the state of North Carolina, fortunately it was voted down, but they had a bill in that would have legally precluded the ability of any planning body to take into account climate models on sea level rise for building standards.
Yeah, I would add to that I think this is highlighting the difficulty of making decisions between the individual homeowners who are devastated, don't either have in some cases still don't have a place to live, and need to have their individual properties taken care of, and balancing that with what does the community as a whole need to do with respect to resilience and sustainability over time. And in some cases, in too many cases, the local governments don't even have the capacity to address those kinds of planning questions to the degree that they might wish they could. So, as Governor Whitman said earlier, in the end, people act because, or governments act because people press them to, and at the moment, there's not enough people pressing government to take into account those issues.
Next question. Barrier islands are one thing. What do we do about urban areas like Hoboken or Keansburg that are affected by flooding because you can't raise brownstones?
In those cases, you're probably going to have to do a lot of hardening. Hardening is going to have to be done in those areas because much as we may like to restore some of those areas or otherwise address the problem, you're not going to raise a brownstone or an apartment building 10 feet off the ground. You're going to have to harden the shoreline and figure out how you couple that. And Hoboken is an interesting example because there is effectively a green belt. I don't know if you could quite call it a green belt, but water came in Hoboken, both in the northern edge of the city and the southern edge of the city, and then wrapped around behind the city and got caught. And a lot of people that got flooded were actually not next to the shoreline. And so you're going to have to figure out how both to harden the shoreline, prevent some of that water coming in, but also to develop some of the kinds of green and softening areas in that green belt, if you will, that will capture rainwater and maybe deal with it in a better way than now occurs when it all just keeps rising and then ultimately floods the area. That I think you'll see in this Rebuild by Design. There'll be some very interesting projects addressing questions like that.
I think if you're going to make a decision, there's enough value in the property or what is located there that it needs to be saved, and it needs to be a very overt, open, transparent public policy decision that is fully costed out so the public's informed on how you're going about doing that. If you look at the countries of the Netherlands and Belgium, these are countries that lie below sea level to a great extent. They have a very robust levee and dike system, but that is part of a national decision that has been made and invested in, and it's been done transparently.
And I was just going to mention the Netherlands. What they're doing, they're a good model to look to because they've been there for centuries. They have old buildings and yet they're doing things to protect them, and they will. They've done a good job in the past.
If I can make one other comment, it relates to the back door, as I would call it. There was flooding in the lower Ninth Ward outside New Orleans as it relates to a levee failure. Most of the flooding in New Orleans proper was not a result of levee failures. It was water being forced up into Lake Pontchartrain that entered the city through drainage canals that were used to pump water out of the city. Those canals were not hardened to the levee strength, and the walls collapsed and the city was flooded from the rear. So when you're looking at how to assess hardening, what you really need to look at is the overall holistic protection of that particular area and what it's going to take.
And one more point on it, it also underscores that we need to create, in many respects, in this country, some of the culture, if you will, of water and understanding of water that exists in the Netherlands. They've lived with it for a long time and are so far ahead of virtually every place else in the world. And in particular this country, we've got to think of our shorelines the way the Dutch think about their shorelines if we're going to ever get on top of these issues.
And the largest concentrations of levees in this country is not Louisiana, it's in and around Sacramento.
Sacramento, California. And Governor Evans, I know when you were governor, you sent Jane Kenney and others to the Netherlands.
We sent a group over, but I will confess, we made a big effort on planning. I sent a group over to the Netherlands of the cabinet, and we tried to break down as many silos as we could to get people to do long-range planning and do it together in a comprehensive way that understood that roads and bridges affected housing, affected the environment, everything was inclusive, but we weren't looking at climate change.
This overall notion of water management, I think, is going to take on a new meaning. And I know everybody wants their kid to be involved in computers and cybersecurity right now. I would encourage my grandchildren to become water engineers.
I would second that because water is, to me, is the #1 environmental issue facing the 21st century. Water quantity and quality, not just in this country, but around the world, and it affects it's not just storm damage, it's also what it means to deployment of our troops. It's a national security issue. The good admiral, as he said, may have to do a lot more patrolling up there when the Bering Straits open up, and who has the rights to the oil that they think is under there. Much less how do we respond when there are disasters in sub-Saharan Africa because of the fact that people are starving and we're having people displaced, and once you get population displaced, you have government destabilization, and we often respond when there are those kinds of things. There are a host of issues that are going to come at us from the issue of water.
I'm going to interrupt the stream of questions because one just came in that I think ties in nicely, and this will let you think globally. The question is, given the way our society and the world's nations govern, and given that sustainability is a global issue, can you imagine a global governance model that we might move to in the future to create long-term equity, prosperity, and environmental resource stewardship?
No.
Next question.
Regional models, perhaps, but I don't think we're going to see another a Kyoto-like approach. It just is, right now, at least for the foreseeable future, is too difficult. It would be more regional agreements.
You know, we're taking baby steps in that regard into dealing with what I call the various global commons we have to deal with. If you think about it, there's a lot of collaboration right now in collecting data in regards to weather forecasting. In fact, that's probably one of the largest, most collaborative actions that takes place on this globe. We provide weather information to people that hate us, and we get weather information from people that hate us. It all goes into forecasting, and there's a system out there that works. And that's because there's a commonly held set of values that it's in everybody's best interest to collaborate and to share. That has yet to be built.
Patrick, question from Twitter. Did polling reveal a split between people satisfied and unsatisfied because they were allowed to rebuild?
No, it was kind of interesting because whether they got into the house, whether they were just had to repair it, whether they were required to totally rebuild it and have it torn down, all these things. And there really wasn't a difference in terms of their satisfaction with the way things were going in recovery. And I was fascinated.
Next question. New Jersey has backed out of regional cooperation efforts like the Regional Greenhouse and the Arc Tunnel. How can New Jersey and neighboring states cooperate to solve problems that have no resolution at the state level?
Well, the how's pretty easy. We start to do it. And seriously, if the governor had his reasons for withdrawing from Reggie. As a believer in climate change and recognizing Mother Nature really could care less about geopolitical boundaries, I think it's important that we do those kinds of things. We did some of that when I was governor. Actually, we had one agreement with France, which the State Department didn't like much. They weren't supposed to do international treaties. I thought it was short-sighted of them because their environmental standards were as good as ours, and so why couldn't we be mutually appreciative of that fact? But we're going to see more of that, and there's now actually a discussion, there has been a discussion in the legislature of taking another look at Reggie, and maybe we should go back into it. It's obviously it comes down to dollars and cents, and again, it's that argument and that difficulty of getting people to understand that, well, it's two phases. It's getting people to be willing to pay more or change behavior for a problem they may not really see or believe is real. And it's getting people to understand also that individual behavior has a cumulative impact, and that together we really can make a difference if we work together with these other states. And that, oh, by the way, if we were to reduce our carbon footprint, irrespective of climate change, let's just get away from climate change. The World Health Organization had a stunning, in quotes from me, revelation last week in a study that bad air quality affects human health. We've kind of known about that for a long time. I didn't think we needed a big study to say it. But seriously, if for no other reason than what's emitted when we are emitting pollutants, when we are getting our fossil fuel to help us enjoy our everyday lives, that's having an impact on human health and quality of life. If we don't understand that, we do understand it, we do know it, and we should be willing to take steps to address it, because it's very clear, whether you believe in climate change or not, it's a good thing to try to reduce those emissions because that's good for human health.
Okay, this question was addressed to Governor Whitman, but I'm also going to ask Patrick if you can dig into the recesses of your memory, and it deals with home rule. And it's, do you see any practical steps that could be taken to discourage the home rule provincialism in this area? Patrick, I'll ask you, I know you've polled on that in the past, so maybe you can chime in as well.
Yeah, from the polling perspective, in terms of people's willingness to even consider giving up some home rule if they saw better planning, it was less about better planning and more about saving money for taxes. There was a window that opened up in 2006. We saw a slight movement in the numbers that we've been tracking, I've been tracking for years, on the public's willingness to consider, and this was just to consider giving up some home rule. But it was all about seeing a bottom line difference in their tax bills more than anything else than delivery of services. That window closed, though, or at least shut somewhat. I mean, it could potentially open up again. There was some leadership issues back then that opened that window. There was a special session of the legislature, if you recall, and that was kind of pushing people to think that maybe there will be some big change and that we'd be willing to give up some home rule in order to see those changes happen. But there's a level of distrust of government at all levels, but less so at the local level, that people say, look, at the end of the day, I'd rather not give up my home rule because I don't believe that things would get better.
We've had stutter starts at this forever. I mean, back when I was a freeholder in the 1980s, in the early 90s, there was the Morris 2000, where Morris and Somerset counties and communities were getting together to recognize again that what a development in Morris County depending on where you were on the highway, could have an impact in Somerset County because of the road and traffic and those sorts of things. So you did see some planning there. You have the Regional Plan Association that is constantly trying to encourage our communities to work together. We, when I was governor, tried more the carrot approach of getting communities to share services. And what was boggling to my mind was the only group that actually agreed to give up some of their home rule was, I think it was 4 fire companies in Essex County that agreed to merge. I mean, they're all unionized, so they were the last group that I would have thought would have said, right, we will in fact merge our departments together, which they did, and they've saved the taxpayers innumerable amounts of money. This governor is using a more stick approach to try to get communities to be willing to, not to be willing to, but to do some, give up some of the home rule, because the frustration always from the governor's perspectives is you get blamed for property tax, but you don't level the property tax, you don't raise it, you don't spend it. That's at the community level, and people will complain about it, and you say, okay, but you live on East Main Street, and there's a firehouse next to you, and down 3 blocks on West Main Street in the other municipality, which is just down the block, is another firehouse. But you will not merge because everybody wants to see their own town's name on that fire truck or that police truck. And again, it gets back, the thing that will motivate people is money, but frankly, it hasn't been as much of a motivation as I would have thought.
I just add that contrary to popular opinion, we have 4 very good examples of regional planning in New Jersey. The Pinelands, the Meadowlands, the Great Swamp, and the Highlands. And there are flaws, been some issues with it over time, but on the whole, they've added to property values, they have controlled development, they have preserved property, preserved open space. They've done a lot of good things. What it takes, leadership. We need people to step up and lead and do the things that have to be done to force the issue sometimes. And if you don't force the issue, it won't happen in my mind, because home rule is something that is ingrained in people for whatever series of reasons, but we need the leadership to do it again on the coastline. And if it, as I said earlier, you can't get a coastal commission. We need to do things that force people to look across borders and work together to solve these problems.
Just one more thing about this is that back in 2009 with the Urban Coast Institute, we did a coastal survey from Long Island down to Virginia Beach. So 5 states were involved, coastal residents. And so it's not just a New Jersey issue. One of the things that we looked at was what were their highest priorities, what were residents' priorities for promoting resiliency in their own communities. And we saw huge regional differences in the emphasis that they wanted to see their local governments pay attention to, which the local governments probably did, which meant that other things were less important, but they were important to people on other parts of the coast who were then affected by the fact that the other part of the coast wasn't paying attention to that because of how interrelated it is. So this is not just a New Jersey home rule issue, this is really a larger regional issue.
You know, one of the wonderful things is there's so many different ways to approach these issues. Chris mentioned early on about the recovery that was going on and the impact on the horseshoe crabs. Now, horseshoe crabs may sound like a big deal. Who cares about them? Well, if you care about natural habitat, then you care about what the horseshoe crab eggs means to the migrating bird population. And that's not just in New Jersey, although we are on the flyway. Delaware is affected by that too. But those eggs are also what are used by the fishermen for bait. The Elvers use it for bait. For the commercial fishermen and the sports fishermen. So they care about it, and they're all up and down the coast. And oh, by the way, the blood of the horseshoe crab is the purest thing that we have, and every drug company uses the blood of the horseshoe crab to ascertain the purity of their drugs. I mean, the interrelationship, the way we are all affected by what's going on in the natural world is there are all different ways to talk to people to say, you know what, it does matter to you what happens to the horseshoe crab. You may not think so, but if you take any drug, it matters to you. If you live on the shore, if you like to fish, there are many different ways that we can appeal to people to try to get them to think beyond just their small, everyday challenges.
Admiral Allen mentioned, seawalls and dunes and not being enough. This question is related to that. As beach and beachfront property rebuilding takes place on the Jersey Shore, are coastal flood mitigation practices such as dunes being implemented and are expanded upon as part of the rebuilding effort? And and I'll amplify that, do we have enough resources, or can we get by with dunes for a while before we have to do the bigger stuff?
Well, I lack the technical background to really answer that properly. I would just tell you my own observation. I mean, it's been 39 years in the Coast Guard, living in coastal areas all around this country, and being involved in some of these responses. As I said earlier, barrier islands were always made to migrate. To migrate with weather patterns, and to try and fix structures on barrier islands is always going to be a problem. So my view, if a artifact of a barrier island like a sand dune or berms or things like that are the answer, it's only going to be the answer to the next storm. Governor Whitman was talking about much larger engineering projects. If you're going to make a decision to preserve something, I think it's going to have to be something much greater than a sand dune. I don't know if I stated earlier on, from 1979 to 1982, I was the commanding officer of Coast Guard in Central Jersey shoreline. Back when we were trying to figure out how we should put the jetties into Barnegat. And, you know, it's not nice to pull Mother Nature, and those jetties have been repositioned several times. There's always some kind of effect that occurs because of the current situation, sand buildup on one side or the other. So you really have to make a commitment if you're going to harden these structures, and it's not going to be no sand.
And I've got one last question, and thank you to everybody sending questions. I have many more questions that we won't be able to get to all of them, so we apologize for that. But this question deals with, and Amaral, and you might kick it off. You were appointed by Governor Cuomo with their response commission, and the question deals with, given the fact that, you know, as all of you said, Sandy didn't stop at the state line or the county line. What are the prospects for not a global getting together, but a multi-state approach and attack to dealing with these issues?
I think it's absolutely critical. Risks are regionally based. They're based on either watersheds or environmental unit of analysis that defy political lines. Sandy involved multiple states, but it also involved the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, entities that are cross boundaries that are there for other reasons. And I don't think you can have a meaningful planning process that reduces risk and increases resiliency unless it's done on a regional basis with all the players that are consequential.
I'm actually hoping that the Rebuild by Design competition that I mentioned earlier will help in that regard, because this is, by the way, these groups, there were 145, I think, or 147 international teams that responded. We have some of the best and brightest people around the world that have come together to participate in this design competition. The 10 remaining teams spent the beginning of this process just learning about the region, and they've done more analysis of natural systems and engineering issues. And what I'm hoping will come out of this, among other things, is the understanding of what happens when you put some controls, whether they be hardening or whatever. What happens when you put them in this area? What's the impact at the next area downriver, or a few towns over, or whatever it happens to be? So I'm hoping that that kind of work will almost force some of this interjurisdictional work that needs to be done if we're ever going to solve the problems that we're dealing with today.
Ladies and gentlemen, how about a hand for our distinguished panel? Andy Rosen.